Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now in our study to the classic. Some have argued the most important poem of all of Leaves of Grass, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. This is a set of introductory comments that we will now work through. The argument about what's the greatest poem in Leaves of Grass, I mean, for many people, it's kind of a knockdown argument. Well, Song of Myself. But many will say, well, Song of Myself is not actually a poem. It's more like a whole bunch of poems. And, you know, there's a lot of truth to that, obviously. But when we look specifically now at Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, we are looking at the title that for many is, without question, the most important title. Thoreau called it, along with Song of Myself, the most important. Some have said that, you know, Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking and When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloom, along with Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, is the most important stuff of Whitman. Now, there are some assumptions as we begin this set of talks. There are some assumptions that I want to review rather quickly with you. Our first assumption is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Go to the website. Down the left-hand side, you'll see our playlist is called Talks with Walt, and you will find there that we have worked every single title in the Deathbed Edition, from inscriptions all the way up through and including all of the passages of Song of Myself, and we just recently finished our reading of Song of the Open Road. Some of you say, well, all right, I'll say it out loud. Song of the Open Road is probably my favorite thus far. That one speaks directly to me, and I will say, wait, not just yet. Let's finish with Crossing Brooklyn Ferry before you make the declaration that Song of the Open Road is your favorite. Now, we said in earlier lectures that Walt Whitman argued that he wanted to create the New American Bible, and in the way he put his final text together, he intentionally put Crossing Brooklyn Ferry right after Song of the Open Road. We're going to hear lots of what we call echoes, and we'll have more to say about that in a bit. Now, we also want to remind ourselves that in room 303, we often like to say that we are the stories that we tell. The stories we retell. We're also the stories we decide to either accept or reject, and we've certainly played that game all the way through our reading of Walt Whitman. We will be, of course, critical of much of what Whitman has to say, and we will decide to accept or reject. But I'll again remind us, our challenge is to hear what he has to say with an open mind, and then make the decision of whether we want to accept or to reject. Now, that's all built off of our notion of our learning theory. Again, we define learning in room 303 as that desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. We also like to say the new is the new, the NEW is the KNEW, and we want to show respect, obviously, to that which came before. I mean, it's always the question, dude, why should I be reading something that was written 150 plus years ago? Like, why? What's the point of it all? And we will often say, well, you know, the new is the new. And a whole lot of the questions that we today grapple with, we're going to find in, for example, a text like Leaves of Grass. There's no question that Whitman himself was a great reader, as we have pointed out, and we're going to see lots and lots of echoes. I mean, just think about it. Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Think about the number of times in great works of literature that we have crossings, okay? Of course, the most probably significant would be our study of Dante and the Inferno and the crossing of the famous river with Charon, right? We also will assume that you have some sense of our annotative approach. In other words, as we look at these titles and as we work through the 9 sections of Ferry, we want to annotate. Now, I am challenging you, and so many of you have picked up my challenge, and I'm grateful for it. Get your own copy of the Deathbed Edition of Leaves of Grass and annotate internally, externally taking notes. But as you annotate, reminding you, we're always working at 3 levels. Level 1, what does the text say? Level 2, what does the text mean? Level 3, how can I relate to this text in some way, i.e., how can I learn from this text? At level 1, we're summarizing. At level 2, we will divide it. 2A, themes and messages, right? Not what Whitman says, but more particularly why Whitman will say what he's saying. What's themes, messages? And then at 2B, we're asking about rhetoric. Not what Whitman says, but how Whitman says it. And here we're focusing on literary techniques of all different kinds. I mentioned echoes and repetitions before. Finally, at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? We'll divide, first of all, into 3A. How can I relate to other texts? We'll begin with the earlier titles. Some of you were working through Song of the Open Road, and literally every line, almost every word, you were like, that reminds me of something I read in starting from Pomanak or Song of Myself or whatever. We're constantly playing that game with Leaves of Grass. But then we're also asking about other titles. How was Whitman, for example, influenced by earlier thinkers? He was a great reader, although he didn't have much of a formal education. He was a great reader. And in that regards, we'll ask, what were some of those readings that influenced him? I mean, obviously, to call it Crossing Brooklyn Ferry will immediately make us think about not just Dante, as we mentioned, but any number of other topics as well, from Milton's Paradise Lost to obviously the Homeric tradition of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then obviously Virgil's Aeneid comes to mind right away, so we're always asking those questions. Finally, and most importantly for our study of 3B, we ask, how can I own this text? That is to say, how can I relate it to myself? And I will give you guiding questions that I hope will facilitate that learning. The next assumption is that you're familiar with what we call our Big Five in room 303. That is to say, about any text we study in 303, we always ask about 5 things. What does this text say about epistemology? That is to say, what can I know? Epistis, knowledge. And we will point out that we have basically 3 options epistemologically. 1, absolutist. I know what I know I'm right, and I know if you don't agree with me, you're wrong. The only problem with this approach is that it leads to a lot of serious problems in the history of the world. As we have said many times, it can lead to people flying airplanes into buildings and lots of people dying. Yes, this absolutist epistemological position can get us in some serious trouble. Well, there is the relativist position, which is the complete opposite. That is to say, there is no truth, there are no absolutes. Of course, the only problem with that is that you seem to be postulating a truth or an absolute when you say there is no absolute or there are no absolutes. And to that degree, because of the performative contradiction, we will say that the relativist position epistemologically kind of falls on its face. Well, then what am I left with? And this is why I believe that often people are driven back to the absolutist position. Well, there is a third position. It's actually a very Whitman-esque epistemological position. It's the fallibilist position. And it says the following. About anything I think I know, I say simply the following. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. It's that I could be wrong that makes science science and not scientism. It's that moment that we're going to see again and again in Leaves of Grass where we're willing to be curious or challenge our fundamental assumptions, recognizing we will believe in those assumptions and those beliefs until somebody gives us hardcore data or evidence to prove otherwise. And so that's the epistemological position. Our second of our Big Five is ontology. What does the text say about who we are? It's an interesting question to ask. Who are you? Well, obviously you're this body, but you've also got this amazing thing called a mind, which is capable of, thinking. And if I cut open your brain, it's not like I'm going to find your mind there. Well, the mind is something quite different from the body, and of course that dualism isn't alone. We also have the capacity to recognize that we are thinking thoughts. Well, who is that, or what is that that's able to stand somehow outside or behind the mind and think? That is to say, we are, in fact, a Trinity that is one. And this is why St. Augustine was able to talk about the Trinity as he spoke about it, because he could feel it in his own human body. That is to say, ontologically, there's all kinds of questions about who are you? And think of it this way. Are you, for those of you especially who have been following our lectures, are you the same you that started Leaves of Grass and read the very first inscriptions poem? Or have you somehow fundamentally shifted? Well, we know biologically you have, if you've been following for over the last months, years, right? But what else? Are you shifting in terms of your thinking, your cognitive capacities and the like? Thoreau will argue in Walden that we have to build those castles in the air, but then we got to put those foundations ontologically underneath them. Speaking of foundations, our third Big Five is psychology. Our fourth is sociology. Psychology, study of the individual mind. What is it that leads to our motivations and our actions? And then sociology, what leads to our group understandings, right? In other words, it's a dance that we'll always say. Of course it is your life, but in some ways it's never been your life. I mean, first of all, 2 people hooked up and exchanged fluids to produce you. Let's go ahead and just get that out of the way now. You didn't have much choice in the matter on that count. But at the same time, while it's always been about us, community, sociological, We also, of course, have our own individual ways of thinking, and so there's that interesting dance between the individual and the group, which is, of course, for Whitman, what is fundamentally amazing about being an American, right? We celebrate both, okay? Finally, and Whitman would probably argue most importantly, it's as if all of these lead to number 5 in our big 5, the question of theodicy. Why must there be pain and suffering in this world? And can I find any meaning in that pain and suffering? We have said before that Whitman's theodicy in Leaves of Grass is a profound one. When bad things happen, we have to learn how to ask, not, why did this happen to me? But rather, why did this happen for me? In other words, all pain, all suffering is a propedeutic, constructional. Now, of course, Whitman learned this from his study of Plato and especially Socrates, and of course his readings of the religious texts that he was so immersed in as well. The next assumption is that you've had some exposure in previous lectures to what we will call our 5 perspectives on Whitman, our 5 P's. There are 5 ways that we're looking at Whitman as we now pick up this text, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. That is to say, we want to see, first of all, Whitman as person. He physically actually took this trip across the river again and again and again. And when they finally built that beautiful bridge, he was not always completely excited about it because he liked the idea of the use of the ferry to get across the river. We're going to see Whitman as poet, no question, an amazing poet, even though he didn't intend to be a poet, and he certainly didn't start out thinking, I'm going to be a poet that will write poems that, is going to be read. But by the time he's writing Brooklyn Ferry and we're reading it, he in fact recognizes that he is a poet. But he's more. He started out as a teacher, so our next P is Whitman as pedagogue, Whitman as instructor, Whitman as teacher. I have made this argument, and I think it's a legitimate one, that the only real way to read Leaves of Grass is to remember that Whitman started in a classroom and then left the classroom through his journalistic projects, and then finally became the poet and the writer of Leaves of Grass. And I think there's all kinds of instruction, and when he's using that term camarero in Song of the Open Road at the conclusion, he is the teacher, even though he tells you to not mind the cry of the teacher. Of course, the 4th of our piece for Whitman is politician. His love of democracy, his fear of democracy, we should say. And this political tension that we will constantly see, we're going to see it in Brooklyn Ferry as well, will be profound for us. And then finally, and this is going to be huge for our reading of Ferry, and I think there's a reason why many consider this his greatest poem, Whitman as philosopher. Whitman as thinker. He's in fact going to use the word meditations in the very first stanza, or very first section of Ferry, and we have to think of our Marcus Aurelius' meditations when we read that. Of course, he was very influenced by Socrates all the way through it, including, obviously, the thinking and the philosophic understandings of Emerson. Now, at LearnStrong.net, we've given full lectures on all those essays of Emerson, and obviously Thoreau's Walden, and a whole lot of the poetry of Emily Dickinson, and those are contemporaries of Whitman that we're constantly understanding. Philosophically, he's drawing on as well. Well, finally, the hope is that, again, you get your own copy, you annotate it. The best way is to approach this by reading it on your own and then coming to our comments as a guide, as a help. Let's now do what we always do when we pick up a new poem in Leaves of Grass, and let's go to, first of all, our Nortons, and Nortons will give us this background information. Brooklyn Ferry, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, was first called the Sundown Poem of the 2nd edition, the most distinguished of the new poems of 1856, taking its present title, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, in 1860. It's possible that Whitman began his composition even before the 1st edition went to press, for many of its lines are entered into one of his notebooks of the period. The revisions through the various editions, some 14 lines were dropped and quite a number of phases amended, reveal the constant improvement in a composition whose first version evinced mastery of artistic power. With exalted and sustained inspiration, the poet presents a transcendent reality unlimited by the tyranny of time or person or space, a poetic demonstration of the power of appearances, quote, dumb, beautiful ministers, unquote, to affirm the soul. Philosophical in theme, the poem is yet profoundly personal, his own daily experience made illustrious, and its strength lies in its aesthetic vision. Now, Whitman himself, interestingly, had a couple of things to say in his notebooks that are of importance. He said the following: "My own favorite loafing places have always been the rivers, the wharves, the boats, I like sailors, stevedores. I have never lived away from a big river. He also said, in specimen days, I've always had a passion for ferries. To me, they afford illimitable streaming crucicos, the sky and the stars that speak no word, nothing to the intellects, yet so eloquent, so communicative to the soul. Very much like Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain, he loved rivers and he loved water in general. So as we pick up now our reading of Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, we're going to obviously ask questions that have to do with his appreciation of ferries and of land. Obviously, we're going to talk about the ways in which, why is this poem philosophically understood to be such a profound poem? Well, how are we going to approach now to finish our introductory set of comments? Well, we're going to work one section at a time, just like we have done so many of the earlier poems. Again, this dividing of the poem up into sections is significant. We'll talk at length about why it is that he's maybe doing that and the argument that he's building. And when we get to passage 5, what many consider to be the heart of this poem, we'll ask questions about why it is the heart of the poem. We're going to pay attention to all of the echoes, and we're going to ask about how this poem especially will have tremendous influence on thinkers to come. Especially, I'm going to make the argument of T.S. Eliot. I mean, just think about the opening lines of Burnt Norton, time present and time past are both perhaps present and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction. And we're going to come back to this idea in Ferry. Finally, in 3a, we're going to think about all of the classic texts, the traveling texts as we'll call them. And think about it, everything from the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, to Dante and to Milton and all of those other titles in between, right? We're going to as well pay attention to the intimacy, I'm going to call it, of Walt Whitman. This idea of a conversation. He will, in fact, say in part 7, who knows, he says, maybe I'm looking at you now. That intimacy is compelling. The curious Walt will be what we will emphasize, and I hope that we will be curious with him since he is curious with us. Now, let's turn to section 1, speaking of curiosity, and let's just enjoy taking the crossing with Walt Whitman. Thank you.